Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
With Amex Platinum,
welcome to the Centurion Lounge.
You get access to the Centurion Lounge, so the sounds of vacation start before you get there. That's the powerful backing of American Express. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/withAmex.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Road to Glory, written by E. Alexander Powell and published in 1915. This book looks at the earliest days of the United States and its road to glory. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a quick ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. If you'd like to become a sponsor or patron, you can do so by going to theboytosleep.com website. As I mentioned, my goal is to keep this podcast free. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month to remove the ad at the beginning of each episode. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. Another wonderful way to show gratitude is by sharing the podcast with someone who might also need a good night's rest. If you'd like to say hello to me, you can do so at theboytosleep.com website. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Road to Glory by E. Alexander Powell. Foreword. The great painting, it is called Vers la Gloire, if I remember rightly, reaches from floor to ceiling of the Pantheon in Paris. Across the huge canvas, in a whirlwind of dust and colour, sweeps an avalanche of horsemen, dragoons, lancers, guides, hussars, chasseurs, with lances levelled, blades swung high, banners streaming, France's unsung heroes in mad pursuit of glory. The picture brings home to the youth of France the fact that the nation owes as great a debt of gratitude to men whose very names have been forgotten as to those whom it has rewarded with titles and decorations. It teaches that a man can be a hero without having his name cut deep in brass or stone. That time and time again, history has been made by men whom the historians have overlooked or disregarded. This is even more true of our own country, for 3/4 of the territory of the United States was won for us by men, whose names are without significance to most Americans. Nolan, Bean, Gutierrez, McGee, Kemper, Perry, Toledo, Humbert, Lallemande, Diori, Mina, and Long. These names doubtless convey nothing to you, yet it was the persistent and daring assaults made by these men upon the Spanish boundaries which undermined the power of Spain upon this continent and paved the way for Austin, Milham, Travis, Bowie, Crockett, Ward, and Houston to effect the liberation of Texas. On the other side of the Gulf of Mexico, the Kempers, McGregor, Hubbard, and Matthews harassed the Spaniards in the Floridas until Andrew Jackson, in an unofficial and almost unrecorded war, forced Spain to cede those rich provinces to the United States. In a desperate battle with savages on the banks of an obscure creek in Indiana, William Henry Harrison broke the power of Tuchman's Indian Confederation, set forward the hands of progress in the West a quarter of a century, and incidentally changed the map of Europe. A Missouri militia officer, Alexander Doniphan, without a war chest, without supports, and without communications, invaded a hostile nation at the head of 1,000 volunteers, repeatedly routed forces many times the strength of his own, conquered, subdued, and pacified a territory larger than France and Italy put together, and after a march equivalent to 1/4 of the circumference of the globe, returned to the United States. He returned bringing with him battle flags and cannon captured on fields whose names his country people had never so much as heard before, a missionary named Marcus Whitman by the most daring and dramatic ride in history, during which he crossed the continent on horseback in the depths of winter, facing death almost every mile from cold, starvation, or Indians, prevented the Pacific Northwest from passing under the rule of England. Matthew Perry, without firing a shot or shedding a drop of blood, opened Japan to commerce, Christianity, and civilization, and made American influence predominant in the Pacific. Certain of these men have been accused of being adventurers, as they unquestionably were, but what, pray, were Hawkins and Raleigh and Drake? Others have been condemned as being filibusters, an accusation which in some cases was doubtless deserved. But were Jason and his Argonauts anything but filibusters who raided Colchis to loot it of the golden fleece? Adventurers and filibusters, though some of them may have been, they were brave men, and makers of history. But it was their fortune or misfortune to have been romantic and picturesque, and to have gone ahead with the formality of obtaining the government's commission or permission, which in the eyes of the sedate and prosaic historians has completely damned them. But as we have not hesitated to benefit from the lands they won for us, it is but for doing them the barest justice to listen to their stories. And I think you will agree with me that in their stories there is remarkably little of which we need to feel ashamed, and much of which we have reason to be proud. Devious and dangerous were the roads which these men followed, amid the swamps of Florida, across the sun-baked Texan prairies, down the burning deserts of Chihuahua, over the snowbound ridges of the Rockies, into the miasmic jungles of Tabasco, along the pirate-haunted coasts of Malaysia, across the Indian country, through the mined and shot-swept straits of Shimonoseki. But no matter what perils bordered them, or into what far corner of the earth they led, at the end glory beckoned and called. This story properly begins in an emperor's bathtub. The bathtub was in the palace of the Tuileries, and, immersed to the chin in its cologne-scented water, was Napoleon. The 19th century was but a 3-year-old. The month was April, and the trees in the Tuileries garden were just bursting into bud, and the first consul, he made himself emperor a few weeks later, was taking his Sunday morning bath. There was a scratch at the door, scratching having been substituted for knocking in the palace after the Egyptian campaign, and the Mameluke bodyguard ushered into the bathroom Napoleon's brothers Joseph and Lucien. How the conversation began between this remarkable trio of Corsicans is of small consequence. It is enough to know that Napoleon dumbfounded his brothers by the blunt announcement that he had determined to sell the great colony of Louisiana, all that remained to France of her North American empire, to the United States. He made this astounding announcement, as Joseph wrote afterward, with as little ceremony as our dear father would have shown in selling a vineyard. Incensed at Napoleon's cool assumption that the great overseas possession was his to dispose of as he saw fit, Joseph, his hot Corsican blood getting the better of his discretion, leaned over the tub and shook his clenched fist in the face of his august brother. "What you propose is unconstitutional," he cried. "If you attempt to carry it out, I swear that I will be the first to oppose you." White with passion at this unaccustomed opposition, Napoleon raised himself until half his body was out of the opaque and frothy water. "You will have no chance to oppose me," he screamed, beside himself with anger. "I conceived this scheme, I negotiated it, and I shall execute it. I will accept the responsibility for what I do. I scorn your opposition." And he dropped back into the bath so suddenly that the resultant splash drenched the future King of Spain from head to foot. This extraordinary scene, which, ludicrous though it was to vitally affect the future of the United States, was brought to a sudden termination by the valet, who had been waiting with bath towels, shocked at the spectacle of a future emperor and a future king quarrelling in a bathroom over the disposition of an empire, falling on the floor in a faint. Though this narrative concerns itself from beginning to end with adventurers, if Bonaparte himself was not the very prince of adventurers, then I do not know the meaning of the word. It is necessary for its proper understanding to here inject a paragraph or two of contemporaneous history. In 1800, Napoleon, whose fertile brain was planning the re-establishment in America of that French colonial empire which a generation before had been destroyed by England, persuaded the King of Spain by the bribe of a petty Italian principality to cede Louisiana to the French. But in the next 3 years things turned out so contrary to his expectations that he was reluctantly compelled to abandon his scheme for the colonial expansion and prepare for eventualities nearer home. The army he had sent to Haiti, and which he had intended to throw into Louisiana, had wasted away from disease and in battle with the locals under the skillful leadership of L'Aventure, until but a pitiful skeleton remained. Meanwhile, the attitude of England and Austria was steadily growing more hostile, and it did not need a telescope to see the war clouds which heralded another great European struggle piling up on France's political horizon. Realizing that in the life and death struggle which was approaching, he could not be hampered with the defense of a distant colony, Napoleon decided that, if he was unable to hold Louisiana, he would at least put it out of reach of his archenemy, England, by selling it to the United States. It was a master stroke of diplomacy. Moreover, he needed money, needed it badly too, for France, impoverished by the years of warfare from which she had just emerged, was ill prepared to embark on another struggle. There were in Paris at this time 2 Americans, Robert R. Livingston and James Monroe, who had been commissioned by President Jefferson to negotiate with the French government for the purchase of the city of New Orleans and a small strip of territory adjacent to it, so that the settlers in Kentucky and Tennessee might have a free port on the Gulf. After months spent in diplomatic intercourse, during which Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, could be induced neither to accept nor reject their proposals, the commissioners were about ready to abandon the business in despair. I doubt, therefore, if there were 2 more astonished men in all of Europe than the 2 Americans when Talleyrand abruptly asked them whether the United States would buy the whole of Louisiana, and what price it would be willing to pay. It was as though a man had gone to buy a cow, and the owner had suddenly offered him his whole farm. Though astounded and embarrassed, for they had been authorized to spend but $2 million in the contemplated purchase, the Americans had the courage to shoulder the responsibility of making so tremendous a transaction, for there was no time to communicate with Washington, and no one realized better than they did that Louisiana must be purchased at once if it was to be had at all. England and France were, as they knew, on the very brink of war, and they also knew that the first thing England would do when war was declared would be to seize Louisiana, in which case it would be lost to the United States forever. This necessity for prompt action permitted of but little haggling over terms, and on May 22, 1803, Napoleon signed the treaty which transferred the 1,000,000 square miles comprised in the colony of Louisiana to the United States for $15 million. Nor was the sale effected an instant too soon, for on that very day England declared war. Now in purchasing Louisiana, Jefferson, though he got the greatest bargain in history, found that the French had thrown in a boundary dispute to give good measure. The treaty did not specify the limits of the colony. "What are the boundaries of Louisiana?" Livingston asked Talleyrand when the treaty was being signed. "I don't know," was the answer. "You must take it as we received it from Spain." "But what did you receive?" persisted the American. "I don't know," repeated the minister. "You are getting a noble bargain, monsieur, and you will doubtless make the best of it." As a matter of fact, Talleyrand was telling the literal truth, which must have been a novel experience for him. He did not know. The boundaries of Louisiana had never been definitely established. It seems indeed to have come under the application of the good old rule, the simple plan, and they shall take who have the power, and they shall keep who can. Hence, Though American territory and Spanish marched side by side for 2,500 miles, it was found impossible to agree on a definite line of demarcation. The United States claiming that its new purchase extended as far westward as the Sabine River, while Spain emphatically asserted that the Mississippi formed the dividing line. Along about 1806, however, a working agreement was agreed upon whereby American troops were not to move west of the Red River, while Spanish soldiers were not to go east of the Sabine. For the next 15 years, this arrangement remained in force. The strip of territory between these two rivers, which was known as neutral ground, quickly becoming a recognized place for a refuge for fugitives from justice, bandits, desperadoes, adventurers, and bad men. To it, as though drawn by a magnet, flocked the adventure-hungry from every corner of the three Americas. The vast territory beyond the Sabine, then known as New Spain, and a few years later, when it had achieved its independence, as Mexico, was ruled from the distant city of Mexico in true Spanish style. Military rule held full sway. Civil law was unknown. Foreigners without passports were imprisoned. Trading across the Sabine was prohibited. The Spanish officials were suspicious of everyone. Because this trade was forbidden was the very thing that made it so attractive to the merchants of the frontier, while the grassy plains and fertile lowlands beyond the Sabine beckoned alluringly to the stock raiser and the settler. And though there was just enough danger to attract them, there was not enough strength to awe them. Jeering at governmental restrictions, Spanish and American alike, the frontiersmen began to pour across the Sabine into Texas in an ever-increasing stream. "Gone to Texas" was scrawled on the door of many a deserted cabin in Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. "Go to Texas" became a slang phrase heard everywhere. On the Western River, steamboats, the officers' quarters on the hurricane deck were called the Texas, because of their remoteness. When a boy wanted to coerce his family, he threatened to run away to Texas. It was felt to be beyond the natural limits of the world, and the glamour which hovered over the mysterious and forbidden land lured to its conquest the most picturesque and hardy breed of men that ever foreran the columns of civilization. A contempt for the Spanish, a passion for adventure, were the attitude of the people of our frontier as they strained impatiently against the Spanish boundaries. The American government had nothing to do with winning Texas for the American people. The American frontiersmen won Texas for themselves, unaided either by statesmen or by soldiers. Though these men wrote with their swords some of the most thrilling chapters in our history, their very existence has been ignored by most of our historians. Though they performed deeds of valor of which any people would have reason to be proud, it was in an unofficial, shirt-sleeve sort of warfare, which the national government neither authorized nor approved. Though they laid the foundations for adding an enormous territory to our national domain, no monuments or memorials have been erected to them. Even their names hold no significance for their countrymen of the present generation. In short, they were filibusters, and that in the eyes of those smug folk who believe that nothing can be meritorious that is done without the sanction of congresses and parliaments, completely damned them. They were American dreamers. Had they lived in the days of Cortez and Pizarro and Balboa, of Hawkins and Raleigh and Drake, history would have dealt more kindly with them. The freelance leaders, who during the first quarter of the 19th century made the neutral ground a synonym for hair-raising adventure and desperate daring, were truly remarkable men. 5 of them had held commissions in the Army of the United States. One of them had commanded the French army sent to Ireland. Another was a peer of France and had led a division at Waterloo. Others had won rank and distinction under Napoleon, Bolivar, and Jackson. But because they wore strange uniforms and fought under unfamiliar flags, and because in some cases at least they were actuated by motives more personal than patriotic, the historians have assumed that we do not know about them, or that it will be better for us not to know about them. They take it for granted that it is better for Americans to think that our territorial expansion was accomplished by men with government credentials in their pockets, and when these unofficial conquerors are mentioned, they turn away their heads as though ashamed. But I believe that our people would prefer to know the truth about these men, and I believe that, when they have heard it, they will agree with me that in their amazing exploits there is much of which we have cause to be proud, and surprisingly little of which we have need to feel ashamed. The first of these adventurous spirits, who for more than 20 years kept the Spanish and Mexican authorities in a fume of apprehension, was a young Kentuckian named Philip Nolan. He was the first American explorer of Texas, and the first man to publish a description of that region in the English language. He spent his boyhood in Frankfort, Kentucky, and as a young man turned up in New Orleans, then under Spanish rule, having been apparently a person of considerable importance in the little city. Having heard rumors that immense droves of mustangs roamed the plains of Texas, and seeing for himself that the Spanish troopers in Louisiana were badly in need of horses, he told the Spanish governor that if he would agree to purchase the animals from him at a fixed price per head, and would give him a permit for the purpose, he would organize an expedition to capture wild horses in Texas, and then bring them back to New Orleans. The governor, who liked the young Kentuckian, promptly signed the contract, gave the permit, and Nolan, with a handful of companions, crossed the Sabine into Texas, corralled his horses, brought them to New Orleans, and was paid for them. It was a profitable transaction for everyone concerned. It was so successful that another year Nolan did it again. On the proceeds, he went to Natchez, married the beauty of the town, and built a home. But along toward the close of 1800, the governor wanted remounts again, for the Spanish cavalrymen seemed incapable of taking even the ordinary care of their horses. So Nolan, who was, I fancy, already growing a trifle weary of the tameness of domestic life, enlisted the services of a score of frontiersmen, as adventure-loving as himself, kissed his bride of a year goodbye, and after showing his passports to the American Border Patrol and satisfying them that his venture had the approval of the Spanish authorities, once more crossed the Sabine into Texas. For a proper understanding of what occurred, it is necessary to explain that, though Louisiana was under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Foreign Office, Texas was under the control of the Spanish Colonial Office. Between these two branches of the government, the bitterest jealousy existed, and a passport issued by one was as likely as not to be disregarded by the other. In fact, the colonial officials were only too glad of an opportunity to humiliate and embarrass those connected with the Foreign Office. But Nolan and his men, ignorant of this departmental jealousy and conscious that they were engaged in a perfectly innocent enterprise, went ahead with their business of capturing and breaking horses. Crossing the Trinity, they found themselves on the edge of an immense rolling prairie, which as they advanced became more and more arid and forbidding. There were no trees, not even underbrush, and the only fuel they could find was the dried dung of the buffalo. These animals, though once numerous, had disappeared, and for the 9 days the little company had to subsist on the flesh of mustangs. They eventually reached the banks of the Brazos, however, where they found plenty of elk and deer, some buffalo, and wild horses by the thousands. Establishing a camp upon the present site of Waco, they built a stockade and captured and corralled 300 head of horses. While lounging about the campfire one night, telling the stories and singing the songs of the frontier and thinking, no doubt, of the folks at home, a force of 150 Spaniards commanded by Don Nemesio Salcedo, Commandant General of the northeastern provinces, creeping up under cover of the darkness, succeeding in surrounding the unsuspecting Americans, who, warned of the proximity of strangers by the relentlessness of their horses, retreated into a square enclosure of logs which they had built as protection against an attack by Indians. At daybreak, the Spaniards opened fire, and Nolan fell with a bullet through his brain. The command of the expedition then devolved upon Alice P. Bean, a boy of 17, who from the scanty shelter of the log pen continued a resistance that was hopeless from the first. Every one of the Americans was a dead shot, and at 50 paces could hit a dollar held between a man's fingers, but they were vastly outnumbered. They were unprovisioned for a siege, and as a final discouragement, the Spaniards now brought up a swivel gun and opened on them with grape. Bean urged his men to follow him in an attempt to capture this field piece. "It's nothing more than death, boys," he told them, "and if we stay here, we shall be killed anyway." But his men were falling dead about him as he spoke, and the 11 left alive decided that their only chance, and that was slim enough, heaven knows, lay in an immediate retreat. Filling their powder horns and bullet pouches, and loading the balance of their ammunition on their backs, they started off across the prairie on their hopeless march, the Spaniards hanging on to the flanks of that little party, as wolves hang to the flank of a dying steer. All that day they plodded eastward under the broiling sun, bringing down with them their unerring rifles those Spaniards who were incautious enough to venture within range. But at last they were forced, by lack of food and water, to accept the offer of the Spanish commander to permit them to return to the United States, unharmed if they would surrender and promise not to enter Texas again. No sooner had they given up their arms, however, than the Spaniards, afraid no longer, put their prisoners in irons and marched them off to San Antonio, where they were kept in prison for 3 months. Then to San Luis Potosi, where they were confined for 16 months more, eventually being forwarded, still in arms, to Chihuahua, where in January 1804 they were tried by a Spanish court, were defended by a Spanish lawyer, were acquitted, and the judge ordered their release. But Salcedo, who had become the governor of the province, determined that the hated gringos should not thus easily escape, countermanded the findings of the court, and forwarded the papers in the case to the King of Spain. The king, by a decree issued in February 1807, after these innocent Americans had already been captives for nearly 7 years, ordered that 1 out of every 5 of them should be hung, and the rest put to hard labor for 10 years. But when the decree reached Chihuahua, there were only 9 prisoners left, 2 of them having died from the hardships to which they had been subjected. Under the circumstances, the judge, who was evidently a man of some compassion, construed the decree as meaning that only 1 of the remaining 9 should be put to their fate. Instead of being released upon their arrival at the city of Mexico, as they had been led to expect, the Americans were marched to Acapulco on the Pacific, then a port of great importance because of its trade with the Philippines. Here Bean was placed in solitary confinement, the only human beings he saw for many months being the jailer, had it not been for a white lizard which he found in his dungeon, and which, with incredible patience, he succeeded in taming. He would have gone mad from the intolerable solitude. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this book. If you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.